Welcome to the Mischief. I'm Valen, and this is Vintage Story. Today I'm going to be taking you into the Metal Age, and we are going to be covering a little bit on how you can find metals, smelt them, pour them into molds, and make anvils. So where to begin to get this plethora of tools, weapons, ingots, and all sorts of metal goodies in your life? At the beginning, of course. When you first start out on your adventure, looking for metals on the surface is actually one of the ways that you can collect things. And that would be specifically copper bits that you're going to be looking for. Some of these are going to be a bit more difficult to search for because you're just going to end up finding regular plain stones, maybe some flint or some other variations. You might even find something that isn't copper if you're extremely fortunate. But either way you look at it, you're going to want to bring open your map. Make sure to make note of where these deposits are, because that's actually what is below the ground here, is some copper in stone that you'll probably want to come back for and mine out. But then you can just right click with an empty hand or break the item with any kind of tool or even your empty hand and pick up some nuggets. Once you grab all these ones, I also tend to, just to make it a little bit easier on myself, grab a block and make note of where it is, or at least where the center was for myself in the future, in case my little pick icon isn't exactly accurate enough. But I do find that in a more deserted area where there's just a bunch of sand or something like that, it may be more difficult to dig in later on, but it does tend to make it a lot easier to see the stones laying about than it is in the underbrush, and it's also probably a little bit safer and away from wolves and bears. Don't forget that panning is also a very valid and useful way of getting your copper materials early as well. You're going to want several copper nuggets to start. Now there still is one other way of finding nuggets, and that's by loot, and you might even find yourself some metal tools if you're fortunate enough to find some in some ruins. But besides that, you're going to want at least 40 nuggets of copper to start. On top of that, you're going to want a crucible, which you're going to want to put in some kind of fire pit. In this case, I've got a little bit of firewood in place, and it has these 4 slots just like a cooking pot. By placing the copper nuggets in here in any kind of order if you desire, you can stack them all up, you can spread them out, and it will create 200 units of copper. This essentially means 2 ingots worth of copper. But before you start smelting this up, you're going to want to make sure that you've got some more molds. If you've made a crucible at this point, which I hope you have, then you're going to be able to make some molds. Over here I have some vertical racks which you can make later on once you have made yourself a metal saw. But until then, you might have to just have some of these things. So if I go over here and I grab a hammer mold, place it down, and a pickaxe mold, place that down. These are the 2 things you're going to want to start with. Specifically because a pickaxe is going to allow you to break stone that you can get even more and bigger deposits of copper as well as other materials, and a hammer because the drops from breaking those stones are not actually smeltable as is. You'll need to crush them with the hammer. As each one of these units costs 100 units of metal, if you look at the top here, and this one here is 100 as well, that is why you're going to need 200 units worth, or 40 nuggets of copper to start. So essentially, there you go. Each one of these is representing 1 ingot's worth of these tools on the side. If I grab a nearby torch, I light this up. What I'm effectively doing is I'm going to heat this up as kind of a pre-starter. I'm saving myself some fuel. In previous episodes, I've discussed how you can make charcoal. I recommend going back if you're unfamiliar with how to do that, but it does require a pit kiln. Now over here, I already have a lot of charcoal made up, as well as a lot of different types of copper. If you find copper, you might find some copper bits looking just regular orange, some with the greenish tinge to it, or even malachite. Metals in this game actually have a lot of the regular names as well as some other less common versions like the original scientific names. So you might want to double check something like this, a malachite nugget, which actually when you look at it says 20 pieces smelt into 1 copper ingot. So this is actually 5 units of copper, as it states as well. It's the same thing, but it also can be used as a pigment. That's the only difference here. Now if I grab a little bit of charcoal and I add this to here, it will increase the temperature because firewood will only get up to 700 degrees. So if I get some charcoal in here, it could potentially get up to 1300 degrees. You'll notice that the arrow here has not even started becoming green. That's because when you look at this, the smelting temperature for copper is 1084. So you're going to need to get this up to the right temperature. Now you don't just have to use wood, you could just put some charcoal in there, but often when you're first starting out you don't have a lot of resources, and that's just a way of putting a less expensive resource in there to start heating. Now in this case, you can see that the charcoal might not actually make it long enough for it to smelt these 2 ingots. You might need a little bit more or less, so you're going to want to keep a close eye on it to add in more materials to ensure that this gets smelted. Now, on top of that, you could also use something like, here we go, some peat bricks. Those will get up to 900 degrees, but they burn very rapidly. So you could start with wood, transfer it over to peat, and then transfer it over to something like charcoal. And you'll notice here that the green arrow has started smelting, or at least it started cooking and progressing. I doubt that I'll actually need this other piece of charcoal, because it's most likely going to end up finishing before this drops too low on a temperature. Once you're more familiar with this, you can make your own estimations to figure out if you think it'll actually finish smelting first. Now you notice I've run out of fuel. The temperature is still going, this is still heating up. It's possible that it can actually still finish regardless, because it already has a lot of heat going into it as it progressed. So you notice the temperature here has dropped around 700, but it still ended up finishing. So this might be a little fuel saver for you. Knowing that this is also molten copper now, you can pour it. But if you grab it straight out of here, you might be a bit surprised with the result. It's very hot, so you're going to need a tool. In this case, I'll grab some wooden tongs. Wooden tongs are just made with some sticks and some rope, so it's not exactly a very expensive thing to do. You're going to want to put it in your offhand, and then you can pick up any hot items without any issue going forward, including crafting or moving them around your base. So then while this is still molten, you're going to want to pour it into your molds. Just hold right click while sneaking and you'll pour your units in there. Now if you run out, let's say I only do a partial mold and I run out of materials because I estimated improperly with how much I would need. You can leave that there and add more of the same material later on by just adding more again once you've got enough. Now if you have something else in here that's molten and it ends up solidifying before you're able to pour it, don't worry, you can always heat it back up again to get it molten. You might have to use some more expensive fuels to do so, but at least you should be able to then pour it out. Sometimes it's a wise idea to have a few crucibles just in case you don't have a place for the results to go if you make a mistake. Now these are currently going to be cooling. If I stand on these, I will start taking some damage and injure myself. So again, stay away from hot items like fire pits and molten metals. Once this gets down to a cool enough temperature, say around 200 degrees, it should be solid and you can break it out of these molds. But still be aware you might still need your tongs in order to handle that because it's still 200 degrees after all. Now you might be wondering if these molds are one-time use. Currently they are not, and therefore you can keep reusing them. But molds are not available for all tool types, only some of the more basic ones. So you will need a more advanced method in order to progress beyond that. Now if you want to cool this quicker, it's actually better to have it outdoors instead of underneath some kind of roof, especially if it is raining, because the rain from above can help to actually cool this down faster. So I've waited till morning, or rather used commands to speed things along a little bit faster for the purposes of this video, and you can see that these are now 100 units of hardened copper cold for either one of these. So I can pick them up and take out the items in each of those. I now have a copper hammer head and a copper pickaxe head. If these are still glowing or still hot, all you need to do is go over to a quenching basin, or in this case just any water, throw it in there and it will make a sizzling sound. Once it's stopped sizzling, you can then pick up the item and you can then start using it. Alternately, if it hasn't quite finished cooling yet and you're still using your wooden tongs in your offhand, you can combine it with a stick in a crafting grid. By doing so, you then produce the tool. Even if it's still hot, it will then instantly cool it. By grabbing some of these, I now have a pick and a hammer. Picks are good for breaking a lot of tier 1 items, or at least a copper pickaxe is. You can use it to still break things that you would with your hand. I don't recommend it, but it will break things like cobblestone much faster than if you were to use your hand before. Better than that, it's used for breaking the regular stone that you'll find in the world, especially in some places like that copper deposit that we found over in that dry deserty area. Remember this place where we ended up picking up some of those copper nuggets that we used for our first tools? Now's a good time for you to start digging down. Maybe not exactly where it is, because it could be a little bit challenging and it'll use more materials to make a ladder than it would be to actually just start coming in at a little bit of an angle. So I do recommend that you just create yourself either a stairway down or you just dig straight down with a ladder in your inventory. Once you get down to some stone, you then should start digging. But be careful, sometimes the sand or gravel, if you have any in the area, could start causing a cave-in, and you might want to make sure that you've got enough space in order to prevent that. So in this case, I'm going to break this. It looks like I've got, thankfully, a 1-block area on some of it at least that's preventing a cave-in in this spot. So I should be able to dig down a little bit further and get some of this native copper ore. It currently says at the top that it's medium quality. That means that you'll get a certain amount when you are starting to break these blocks. I'll explain more once we get back to base, but for now, I'm just going to mine up a whole bunch of this copper. If you notice though, it does say it requires tool tier 2 in order to break this copper block, as well as any of these stones that are out and around. This is one way that you can also get all sorts of different stones, is just by breaking them. Alternately, you can just pick them up in the world. Now it may look like this wasn't much of a deposit, but honestly, you have to take something into account. Often, you'll have some variation in the land. If you notice, there's a little bit of a dip here where the gravel ended up dropping down. And if you notice, I dug down right on the edge of this. So 1 block down on this dip above is appropriate to where the strata of the stone goes. So you'll probably want to just dig yourself a little bit more just to make sure you haven't missed anything. Once you've dug down a little bit more, you might find some in the nearby area. You can also ensure if you have any leftover bits using a prospector pick, but I'll be covering that in a specific prospecting video in the future. Now here is a great example of something to watch out for. Quartz. You notice that it actually says tool tier 3 bronze to break, which means if I try using this pick, it won't let me. Not all materials are going to be breakable with a simple copper pickaxe, so you will have to use an alloyed metal type or above in order to actually be able to break this block. So sometimes this can have an entire shelf of quartz in an area that might actually prevent you from even reaching something like some copper blocks. In that case, perhaps panning is a better idea until you can get yourself the few materials that you need in order to break through. There we go. Not the best haul, but I do have 19 chunks, which produces 20 units of copper each, just not in their current form. If I open up my inventory and I take this copper hammer, I can then craft it with this and get all sorts of copper nuggets from them. There we go, I got 76. That's a bit of an increase from the 20 that I started with and probably spent a lot of time looking for out in the world. Returning home, I can show you a little bit about what I had. If you recall, these nuggets were originally in a medium chunk size before I broke them up with that hammer. And if you recall, I was saying that there are several different kinds. Now this is just using some that's in basalt as an example. It could be in all sorts of different kinds of stone, but this is poor, which can get you 15 units each, medium, which gets you 20 units each, rich, which gets you 25 units each, and bountiful, which gets you 35. It is entirely possible that you can find something that can give you a variety of these at one location. Then once you break them down, you get that much more material from them that you can then smelt up into your own tools. So let's talk about a few of the other molds now that I have a lot more copper that I can start crafting with. As far as weapons and armor, we've got a few to choose from. The Falxblade and Lamellae mold. Putting this down allows you to start making a blade for what's the equivalent of a sword, if you think of it that way, and it'll be a melee weapon. It resembles this on the rack. Once I hold it in place, it looks sort of like a tree saw, and it has a rather slow attack animation, but it does a considerable amount of damage more than any of your previous weapons that you might have been using. The Lamellae mold in this case would allow you to craft copper lamellae, or you could use it for other different materials as well, as long as it's a pourable metal. Now, if you haven't upgraded your armor at this point, you probably have a few options. If you've been doing a lot of farming, you could do something with Gambeson armor. Otherwise, this metal armor is a pretty good alternative, though it's not quite as protective. And if I look at the crafting recipe for this, you can see that it requires several of these in order to do so. Each quantity of copper lamellae is the equivalent of 1 ingot's worth, or 100 units of metal. So that would be a lot of smelting. Now you can make multiple molds and just pour a whole bunch of them at once, and this would allow you access to that. Now, if your armor does get damaged, as with multiple other types of armor, you can repair it with a single lamellae in order to upgrade it back from a certain damaged quantity up to a much more repaired version. It might take multiples in order to restore it to its 100% original status. Looking at the Gambeson body armor, it does require a lot more of a different material that is not even metal related, and that's just a whole lot of linen. So if you have maximum amounts of flax stores and you've been really growing the heck out of things, this is actually a really great body armor, helmet and leg armor for you to wear. Will protect you against tier 2 as well, and it has very few drawbacks on it. So it's a good all-around light purpose around the house type of armor that actually looks a little bit more like you're wearing a robe, if anything else. Or just a really stylish jacket if you have the tailor options. And also it repairs with some linen as well. But weapons and armor aside, let's talk more about tools. We've got a prospecting pick, a hoe, shovel, and an axe. Of course, you're probably familiar with these at this point, but your prospecting pick, which is similar to a pick, but very much not the same. It's used for prospecting for other ores, trying to find different ores in locations, whether it be within 8 blocks of you for 100% accuracy, or if it is in the general area during world generation, and if it should be there. But again, this is going to be for another video in the future. Now those are the pourables, but there are a lot of other options that you can actually use copper or other alloys for. Looking up the copper ingot gives you a good idea of the different accesses you then have, considering that you can start making these. Oh wait, how do you make one of those? I almost forgot. There's a whole bunch of ingot molds that you're going to want to be able to use. You can just right-click again in order to make multiples of these and make a whole bunch of them. You can then stack them up and use them in the future once you have an anvil. But making all these ingots straight off the get-go might not be the best way to go. You can actually pour an anvil, then these ingots become a lot more useful, because you cannot work ingots until you actually have an anvil to start with. And each anvil might have a different tier as well. You notice this says tier 1 anvil at the top. That means you can only process certain materials on it. It's a little bit too soft for you to actually start working any of the higher tier weapons, armors, or other tools. So then how does one make a copper anvil? Well, you make it with an anvil mold. And you notice at the top there it says 0 out of 900 units of metal. And it doesn't have to be copper, but whatever metal you pour in there does all have to be the same. Making an anvil mold actually will require a lot of your clay resources, so be prepared for that. On top of that, you'll need 900 units of a metal. That's 9 ingots worth of copper, if that's what you're starting with. Now, there are ways that you could potentially skip to the next tier and make an alloy, like tin bronze, but that usually is a lot more challenging in order to accomplish, because then you do not get access to all of the things that an anvil would grant you. And that's a lot of things, let me tell you. So it's probably worthwhile if you're finding copper deposits out in the world as a most common type, then you should probably pursue that until you have the means to upgrade your anvil later. Don't worry, you can recover your copper anvil into copper bits and use it to resmelt and make other alloys or copper items as you like. So once you've got yourself 900 units of copper ready to go, start heating it up and have your mold ready. And there we have it, one crucible containing 900 units of copper. With this, I can then pour into my anvil mold and make my first anvil to allow me to start smithing. And there we have it, our anvil ready and waiting for the next video. If you enjoyed this video, please be sure to give a like, comment, and subscribe. And don't be afraid to tune in next time, where I'll be showing you how to start smithing things on an anvil. Until next time, folks, I'll see ya.